Hello, everybody. Welcome today to the Deb Williams Second College Scholar Talk of her College Scholar tenure this year. The College Scholars Program showcases faculty excellence in research fields that go beyond the classroom and where faculty are making scholarly contributions to knowledge within your academic discipline. So it's a great way to find out what colleagues are doing besides teaching their classes with excellence. So those of you who are here in faculty and haven't applied before, I would recommend you to take a look at it and apply this year, because there are all sorts of topics and all sorts of options and all sorts of disciplines. So think about that. Deb herself the award started in 2010, and I was looking at her CV and realized this is the fourth time she's received this award. So that's quite impressive. I would say she has accomplishments too many to tell you all about here. She's taught biology and environmental science at JCCC since 2006, and during that she has also served as Faculty Association President and Lead Negotiator. She's also taught at KU Washburn and Haskell Indian Nations University. She's won, as I mentioned, numerous awards, including the JCCC's Distinguished Service Award, the BNSF Railway Faculty Award, and yeah, just too many to read them all here. I've got her very thick CV right here. Some of her more recent accomplishments include serving as a board member for the American Wolf Foundation, an organization that is dedicated to conservation of wolves, particularly the critically endangered red wolf. It's kind of an interesting passion to be pursuing, and also her work serving on the JCCC Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. She's a lifelong resident of Kansas and a lifelong learner, as you will hear when she has multiple degrees, including, I have to read these because they're so interesting and so varied, a bachelor's in life science, a bachelor in animal science and industry, a master's in student counseling and personnel services, a master's in biology, a master's in curriculum instruction, a master's in philosophy, a master's in indigenous studies, a JD, and she is currently working on her PhD in cultural anthropology. So, and she jokingly yet very accurately referred to herself as graduate student emeritus. I would say, in knowing Deb, she's a charismatic, inspirational teacher, and all who know her know the passion, intelligence, and integrity that she brings to everything that she does. So please welcome Deb Williams.
Thank you so much, Farrell, and I think am I on? Awesome. Well, I appreciate the introduction, and when I received an email from Farrell asking me how to introduce myself, I was like, good luck, because I think there's a lot of ways to do that. But interestingly enough, in this presentation, I'm going to try to explain some of those varied degrees and how this project itself unfolded. So let me get my clicker here. I'm not used to having this much space, so my joke last time is if I wander off and I'm out of a mic range, I'm probably wandering outside there somewhere, so somebody come get me. But I'm going to talk about, it seems like when I was driving here, I thought, it doesn't seem sufficient to call this a research project, because what you're about to hear is that this project has been with me for about 17 years. So I'm going to call it an enduring love story, because it really is what it is. And like many love stories, it starts with an encounter and starts with, repetitive maybe, or thoughts and contemplation about engagement with the object of your affection. And that's exactly what happened with this project over that period of time. And as you'll hopefully soon appreciate, I've been doing some other things in those 17 years, but I kept coming back to a potential research question. And in some respects, I think that the 17 years had to pass. For one thing, I feel like I've matured as a scholar and as a person. I think the question has been refined over those 17 years. And actually some of those discipline areas that I encountered and actually now am credentialed in has informed this project. So those of you who were here last Thursday to hear my scientific consequentialism lecture, I left this in here just to kind of poke fun at the fact that this particular presentation is going to be a lot less dense. Scientific consequentialism, potential problems with an outcome-driven paradigm for the scientific study of metaphysically inclusive peoples, was the more academic part of the series. Certainly there's some overlap and some points of intersection between what I'm going to say today, but it's not a This presentation is designed for a more generalized audience, and so probably will be easier to follow along with, but if you want the contents of this other lecture, if you weren't here, I'm happy to share that, and always happy to sit down and have conversations with anyone who wants to talk to me about these topics. So I can't get too far into my presentation without thanking several entities and groups of people, because again, this is a long-term project. So KU and Haskell, certainly. In the middle, there's featured the Bridge Pathway to Biomedical Career KU Haskell Bridge program that I was a program coordinator of at the time that I first had this idea to investigate this question. Certainly, I have to thank the College Scholar Program for their contribution and their support of my research interests over the years. I have had many KU Haskell KU faculty mentors, and my committee members currently certainly have informed my thinking. Haskell students and faculty participants, because the presentation that I'm presenting today is based on a research project that I conducted at Haskell, where I interviewed faculty there and also students across 1 year, but my research is ongoing, so it's continuing to be an experience for me and for relationships with the Haskell folks. My fellow graduate students, it's interesting to think about you guys as students may appreciate this when I say this, that sometimes your thinking is refined just by talking to others who are in similarly situated experiences. And so cultural anthropology is my current PhD focus. Indigenous studies is a program I completed a year ago that was largely the incentivizer for this research program. But philosophy, ecology, and evolutionary biology, all of those play a role as well. So again, I think 17 years, my mom would say, "Why are you dilly-dallying?" Well, I don't think that I've dilly-dallied. I think I've actually accomplished some things in the meantime, and again, that ultimately maybe this is the time that this project needs to happen, and hopefully I can explain why. So thank you to all of you who are here, students of mine, colleagues here that have listened to me talk about this project, and all the others who have shaped me as a scholar along the way. So, as I mentioned, it's in many respects a love story, and it all began with a serendipitous conversation. My joke to friends is there's so much serendipity sometimes in my life, I feel like I could write an autobiography, and it would be called "There I Was, Minding My Own Business," because that's what kind of happened in this story. So I was the program coordinator for the KU Haskell Bridge program. And my job at the time, it was a National Institute of Health funded grant, and my role was to recruit Native students to major in science. So I created a space where students would want to come in and talk to me, get to know me, develop a rapport and trust, and then we would talk about why science should be on their radar as a potential major. Because you'll soon see the stats, then and now, Native Americans are the most underrepresented group in the STEM disciplines. And so this grant, there was several companion grants. There was one at KU. My office was housed at Haskell. And so we tried to work in every way possible to take down the barriers to Native American students majoring in science. So the first thing we need to do is talk to students to figure out why they're not choosing this major. Well, at the time, my office, if you're familiar with the Haskell campus, Sequoia Hall is the science building. And my office was an open space, a cubicle, like so you could kind of walk in like the doors here. And I had a big futon, and I had, again, an inviting space where students would want to come and hang out. And there were other office spaces around me, one of which was shared by non-Native and Native adjunct professors teaching a variety of disciplines, including math and science. So one day, there I was, minding my own business, and a young Navajo adjunct professor walked in, introduced herself, went over to the space that she was supposed to be her office space, and almost immediately turned around, came back in, plopped down on my futon, and asked me if she could spend the rest of her office hours in my office. And I was sure. And so she started talking to me about what I'm going to describe as a taboo in the Navajo culture. So what went wrong in her office space is she walked in and she saw on the wall reptiles of the world. And snakes happen to have a particular significance in the Navajo culture. So we had that conversation, and again, keep in mind, my role was to take away barriers to Native American students majoring in science. And we were working with things like lack of resources, lack of role models. Literally, one of the problems with having access to science was 17 years ago was students didn't have vehicles. So our grant bought a van, and I became the soccer mom of STEM. When we matched students up who decided they wanted to try this thing called science out, I would drive them over to their mentors for their office meetings, or sometimes to their research sites, because we had a couple of students who were working at a site for ecological study, and it required getting to a place, and they didn't have the means to do that. So we tried to anticipate every barrier possible and remove them so that students could have a understanding of science as a possible major and ultimately a possible career. So in all of those things that the literature told us was a barrier to minority student recruitment, or persistence is the fancy term of sticking with science, cultural taboos was not one of them. So how this project unfolded, don't be persuaded that anything about my decision making was this linear. The only thing that's linear is the time element. And so I tried to think through how this started, where I was back, again, 17 years ago. I was a graduate student in ecology and evolutionary biology. At the same time, you can see if I had better PowerPoint skills, this would be more like, this tangled mess that had little thought bubbles radiating out from it. But what is consistent about this is that, again, this march through time, I was a student. I was also the coordinator of this program because that was sort of the funding. You could be a GRA, GTA. This was like a GRA, I guess, in some respects, although I had a teaching aspect to it as well. But in the role of the KU Haskell program coordinator, I had this encounter. So my ecology and evolutionary biology degree was looking at wolf reintroduction efforts in the United States. And there's certainly an ecological aspect to that. There's also a legal aspect to that. And at the time I was exploring and very, very serious about wanting to solve that problem. I felt like I needed to have a better appreciation of law. So I decided, well, why not see if there's I wasn't interested in practicing law, but I thought, well, maybe there's some classes I can take. And actually, at the encouragement of a very good friend who suggested, why don't you go over to the law school and see if you can enroll in one of their environmental law courses. So I'm like, you can do that? I'm not a law student. So I did that. I enrolled in environmental law survey. And the rest, you might say, is history. I loved it. It was very much like science. It was problem solving. So the next semester I'm knocking on the door because there's a course called water law. And so, hi, I'm Deb, I'm back. Could I enroll in water law? And I did. And then ultimately several conversations occurred. Even though I had no interest in practicing law, still have no interest in practicing law. I applied to law school, got admitted to law school. So that's up there as a piece of this puzzle. I can say, again, with a tip to the hat to serendipity, I absolutely would have pursued environmental law as a focus in law school. I would not have pursued the other area of concentration, tribal law and federal Indian law, had it not been for my experiences at Haskell. So I have to give thanks and give appreciation to those experiences along the way. The two, as it turns out, nicely merge. The courses nicely overlap. It was very, very meaningful and enjoyable period of time in my academic life. But it also led to some opportunities. I was hired before law school ended to teach at Washburn as a biology lecturer. And it happened that, again, serendipity, there I was minding my own business, and they had new hires in the faculty ranks for law. One of them wound up talking to me for quite a long time, and ultimately I get a call from their law school asking me if I'd be interested in teaching a class called bioethics and law. And I'm fortunate to say I have one of my online undergraduate bioethics students in the audience. So I'm still teaching bioethics, and there is a legal component to it still. But these decisions along the way that came to me led me down this path that I think refined and formed an approach that I'm taking now. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see going to law school, having an emphasis in tribal law might have some relevance to what I'm doing today. Having a law degree at all has a lot of relevance to the kinds of experiences I've had as a professional and definitely in my personal life. So I've had the good fortune of teaching at both Kansas law schools, bioethics, health law, public health law, and those built relationships, particularly with the folks that are tribal law professionals. But I was teaching bioethics and law, and so for those of you who are wondering when you heard the list, why did she get, she's a scientist, why did she get a philosophy degree? Because I had this kind of moment of imposter syndrome. I felt like I'm teaching bioethics and law to it's a 900 level class. I'm teaching to very highly motivated law students. I know the law, I know the science, and I'm self-taught in the ethics. Maybe I better go formally study ethics. So the best cure for the imposter syndrome is to get credentialed in the thing that you feel like you're lacking understanding of. So I got a master's in philosophy, and I call it applied ethics because a lot of the courses that I had, other than the ones that they make you take that are part of a sequence, the ones that I had control over were very much applied because I like application. I like application in my science, I like application in my law, and I like application in philosophy. And it turns out that becomes a part of this story. And if you were here last Thursday, you got a whole lot of philosophy. You got a lot of applied philosophy as it relates to what I called scientific consequentialism, which is terms that you don't hear in science classrooms, but you hear about consequentialism in ethics classes and ethics disciplines. And it all relates. I promise you that. If you think that you have to pick one level, one major, reject that idea. There's a lot of interesting intersections that if you're interested, I say follow your bliss, figure out how you can make those interests connect. I did, worked for me. So the master's in Indigenous Studies and Cultural Anthropology, that's kind of where I'm at today. And it's because I was in search of a place for this project to land. Is it philosophy? Maybe not quite. We don't have a PhD program in American Indian Studies at KU, but we do have an Indigenous Studies program. So I enrolled in that and sort of created my own degree, I guess, in a way. There's cultural anthropology, so through selecting committee members, that some of who are on both, I created this broader academic experience where the Indigenous Studies master's degree that I finished about literally a year ago is informing the cultural anthropology work that I'm doing today, which this project is a manifestation of, I suppose, or a product of. There's other things, informal things, that one thing may lead to another. So there was National Endowment for Humanities experiences that I sought out and was fortunate to be selected to participate in. Extending Aldo Leopold's land ethic is a philosophy-oriented experience, but it happens that there's a lot of scholarship surrounding indigenous perspectives on the environment as well. I gave a college scholar talk about 2 years ago called Bundles, Pipes, and Mounds, Exploring Nearby Indigenous Cultural Sites, to showcase just how much rich indigenous cultural history we have here within Kansas, or within a day's drive was the focus of that talk. Another NEH Institute in the summer of 2018, and I'm fortunate now, and I have some people in the audience who are part of this cohort of the JCCC NEH project where we're looking at Indian knowledge, Western education. So the my thoughts and my thinking about indigenous studies and how that relates to my own professional experiences has been an ongoing experience, an ongoing, enduring love story, because I really do love this project and where I think it's going. So as part of this, back in the Indigenous Studies program, I did a pilot project and then continued it that resulted in a publication. Cultural taboos is a factor in the participation rate of Native Americans in STEM. This is a screenshot from last week that's inspiring and humbling, actually. Because if you look at the little arrow, it moved a little bit when I loaded it, but I have 3,069 accesses as of last week. So I think I'm on to something. I think I may be on to something. I published this in an open access journal purposefully because I want people to read it, and they are. And so when I put this together, I saw there's like 2 sites there, but in Google Scholars it had a third, and so I followed that link, and it turned out that I'm cited on a Wikipedia page. And I'm like, you're thinking, now you're just bragging, Deb. And I'm like, my first reaction was, this is awesome. Undergraduate and high school students will be plagiarizing me for years to come. But more humbling and exciting about this is that this contemporary Native American issues in the United States is an encyclopedia of its own, where if you scroll down the list and you get to education, and then you get to STEM education, and you read this line, Native American students view human and animal dissections as the most problematic STEM activity. It's kind of stealing my thunder a little bit, but I'll tell you why that's the case. Research suggests that a majority of Native American students will be more likely to take STEM classes if the curriculum was more respectful of taboos. And the sole site is that paper. So I feel like maybe coming back to this at this time in this place was a serendipity of its own right. So now to get into the heart of what this all means and why I think it's very exciting. What we knew then and what I know now still is that Native Americans are underrepresented in the STEM disciplines. So there's always, as a student, a graduate student, you're warned, you should always worry about why do you care? And why should we care about it? What can you do about it? And that's hopefully what this is going to, what's going to unfold. Obviously people are interested in it or they wouldn't be reading that paper, and I wouldn't be having the kinds of conversations that I've been having over the last 4 or 5 years. But we still have this challenge, and I think this research might be helpful in overcoming and solving some of the problems. So what this basically tells us is that, we go to the 2010 census, but there was a more recent analysis of this that tells us that as of 2012, Native Americans, American Indians, and Alaska Natives represent combined in this, for this stats. They're often, you have Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders separately, but if we collapse the two, represents 1.7% of the population, but accounted for only a fraction of 1% of bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral degrees in declining order. So if students are majoring in STEM, it's not very often, Native students majoring in STEM, it's not very often, and even fewer are getting doctoral degrees, which is often the credential that you need to teach, or you can obviously do other things with applied things with bachelor's and master's degrees, but I think this is interesting to work with. Again, many reasons have been articulated, documented in the literature as far as why we have low participation rates of Native Americans in STEM, including all of these things: lack of exposure, lack of role models, lack of resources, lack of science preparation, lack of goal congruency, lack of role models. And so one factor may be a mismatch between the culture's emphasis on communal work goals and the non-communal nature of STEM. I can tell you that's a 2014 site, and I can say right here at Johnson County Community College, we have examples of how that's changing. That STEM has evolved over time, at least some of the biological sciences and the ones that I'm more familiar with. There's a lot of collaboration and interdisciplinarity, fortunately, compared to maybe back when I was an undergrad and a grad student in that discipline. So the question for me is, could there be something else at play? And again, I go back to that serendipitous conversation where, filed away, there was that encounter about how I can't sit in a room because it's uncomfortable and unwelcoming to me. So could it be the way we teach science? I started thinking and riffing off of that. What do we have on display that might be unwelcoming? Are we unknowingly creating these environments that in and of themselves might be keeping students from sticking around or even entering into the degree program? Are there ways for us to be more inclusive? and still, and this is very important for science, to maintain the rigor and honor the integrity of the science curriculum. So over here in parentheses, I have this italicized little conversation with myself. Is there something unexplored in the literature? You know, unknown to the native STEM scholar like me, or science faculty member, and unarticulated by the student, because you're going to hear that that's a part of this as well. Often native students are not, you know, raising their hands saying that I'm uncomfortable with this. They show it by not enrolling in the class, not showing up on the day if there's a dissection. And all of this adds up to either not successfully completing the class or completing an assignment, or just not enrolling in the major at all. And I can back that up with some data I've accumulated through survey. We're asking the students themselves, but also asking science and non-science faculty if what is happening in Western science classrooms has impacted choice of major. But another angle to this, another approach might be, well, what does success look like? We have information on that at the higher ed level, and it's not surprising because this would be true probably for any student. Native American students who succeed in college do so in part because they stayed engaged in the programs of study. And with Native students, by finding meaningful connections between tribal beliefs and practices and the values and goals of American colleges. So we have to figure out what those tribal beliefs and practices are, I would say, because making meaningful connections requires us to understand notions of what's sacred and taboo. And so that's what my research is all about. So taboo and sacred are often justified on moral and religious grounds. We have this, you know, really old quote I thought was interesting because it suggests that, you know, there's an applicability or a utility to taboos as well, which again, I like application. So what do taboos do for us? Harris noted, human society is neither random nor capricious. The regularities of thought and behavior called culture are the principal mechanisms by which we human beings adapt to the world around us, and categorizing things or activities as taboo or sacred is often a form of that adaptation. So those of you who are science majors or are in a science class see this language of evolution, and maybe you're thinking along the same lines I am, that is taboo in some way an adaptive strategy for a set of environmental conditions. But I'm looking at it as a classroom instructor and saying, you know, it's maladaptive if your goal is to have inclusive learning environments and what you're doing unknowingly, because I do believe that it's unknowing to a large extent, is unwelcoming, or maybe to translate it into modern terms for another context, maybe it's a microaggression. Maybe having a poster up that has snakes of Kansas or having certain organisms on display is unwelcoming and unfriendly to a certain culture who's not telling you that it's unwelcoming. And it's not really well documented in the literature, as you're about to see. So the onus is on us as professors and as scholars to try to get out there and figure out what's going on and how we can make changes that don't undercut our science, the rigor of our discipline, but allows the inclusion of more into the mix. So the first step, and I'm not going to read all of this because there was a lot of this on my last College Scholar talk, and when I went back and reviewed the video, I was like, you know, I can say this. I don't have to sit here and read this to you, but basically, like any research study, you have to conduct a literature review. So shocker, little scholarly work has been done on documenting taboos. And if you understand Native American culture, that's not that surprising, because a lot of history and a lot of cultural transmission is not through written documents, it's more through oral communication. And if you're talking about things like taboos and what's sacred and very private and metaphysical, spiritual oriented content, that's probably an intentional thing. However, it's also part of a worry for me is how can we, I'll use the term now and I'll explain it later, accommodate, or how can we best intervene to have more welcoming environments if we don't even know, you know, what we're doing wrong. So the literature review was interesting because there were quite a few websites where this information is communicated, you know, by tribes, tribal-related groups, individual tribal members. And my plan was to have the 566 or so federally recognized tribes, and there's many other more additional unrecognized and state recognized. I wanted to like pick the top 5. Unfortunately, what I had really good information about was the 2 largest tribes, which was Cherokee and Navajo. And as it turns out, Navajo, there's a book on taboos by an author named Bulow that I'll cite that actually was very informative. And as it turns out, my encounter with the math adjunct instructor was Navajo. So it makes sense that maybe there's at least a foundation there. And if I can do something with the Navajo tribe, which is the largest, then maybe I'm making covering some ground as a result. So this talks about the survey design. Basically, I have to ask the demographic information about, tribal membership, age, sex. There, you'll see actually a screenshot of a table that probably says it better visually. But ultimately, for the contribution to our understanding of taboos, the respondents were presented with a list of animals, plants, and activities that are commonly performed in undergraduate Western science laboratories. And they were asked to identify, number 1, if it was a taboo or sacred in some way, and if their discomfort level across the categories that were listed. So calculated percentage of students who identified a particular taboo, as you would, analyze the data. Took about 30 minutes to complete the survey. There had to be operational definitions of taboo and sacred. Here they are. Taboo was described as a strong cultural warning or prohibition against an action. Sacred was defined to mean a strong cultural veneration. So I was asking the students is, at this point, just the students, is this not an individual, but is this a taboo for your tribe? Because that becomes important in the analysis. So again, there's a sample of convenience. These were classes I was teaching at Haskell that year. So from a possible 125 potential respondents, 96 surveys were returned. So a pretty good return rate. And there were students who refused to take the survey, and that's perfectly fine. And of those that returned them, you'll see some, I think, really informative stats come out of this. So 76% completed by members of at least 42 different tribes, with, not surprisingly, the largest group representing the Navajo tribe. 40 respondents were male, 56 were female, and their ages ranged from 20 to 40 years of age. Taboos were identified and emphasized in the literature, were strongly reflected in the survey, and again, primarily, I didn't have much in terms of scholarly, but I had websites, and I had Bulow's book, and I had a little bit more information on the Cherokee, and what I was finding was pretty consistent with what others had documented, if it was documented. So the problematic activities included things like dissections, dead bodies, especially human cadavers, conflicting origin narratives, like the Beringia Hypothesis, which I just touched on in my last college scholars talk. But that doesn't necessarily limit the taboo to science classrooms, because you'll see a quote from a faculty member, a non-STEM faculty member at Haskell, that was talking about this very thing and what that means. And I can tell you, as I said to the audience last week, I have been in graduate courses in Indigenous Studies in the Cultural Anthropology department, taking classes that are often selected to complete both majors, and Native American students getting up and graduate students getting up and walking out of the room when the Beringia Hypothesis was presented. So it's not an insignificant story or hypothesis that's out there, and it's not necessarily in science classes, so it's something maybe informative to other disciplines as well. But dissections, human dead bodies, collections, plant and animal collections made the list of the highest problematic list, most problematic list, I guess. So here's, again, the visual of maybe what we can talk about during Q&A. 96 participants returned the survey out of 126. Male, 40, 56 females, 42 different tribes represented. Raised on reservation, 54%. That was helpful because, as we know from our own history, that there was a real intentional move to assimilate and relocate, and it was successful in the sense that we have a lot of Native students today who are not as connected and familiar with their tribal heritage or their tribal taboos as some. But I had the majority raised on a reservation, 43% attended reservation schools, about half of them generally observe their tribal taboos. And I asked the question, I'm glad I asked it, kind of extending into their, if they don't, what about elders in their community, parents or grandparents? About equal response rate in terms of parents or grandparents generally observing taboos. So then the questions, violating taboo in science class would cause difficulty with a family member. 30% said that it would. The question about would you not major in science if doing so required violating a taboo? 38% said yes. And this is the real key piece. That's the source of that number 85 on the Wikipedia site footnote. Would be more likely to take science classes if science classes were more respectful of taboos. That's the literal line that's on that page, and it comes from this research. So then breaking down more specifically, getting a little bit further in the weeds, what do we do in science classes? Again, is it how we teach, what we teach? Are there certain organisms that are problematic? These organisms, there was a fuller list, but these are the ones that kind of surfaced to the top as being the most problematic. Human dissection, human bodies, animal dissection, snakes, spiders, lizards, horses, frogs, toads, corn pollen, and plant collections. And some of those you might say, well, that makes sense because they're complex animal species, but corn pollen and spiders, and some of these are tribally specific in terms of their significance, but you can see the discomfort level or the percent identifying as taboo becomes a lot more telling as we got into some of the further research.
I was just going to ask and clarify. That means having like a terrarium with the animals that are alive.
Could be. Yep.
So the live animals.
Well, plant collections could be you go out and you collect plants and you press them, you desiccate them, dry them, press them, and have them as part of the collection.
I'm a museum nerd, so that's why.
Cool. Yes.
I guess as long as
Sure. We can do Q&A now. That's fine.
So the data you're reporting here, identifying these as taboo.
Yep.
You also said that you were asking about sacred, which is sort of the opposite.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if, are you excluding this?
No, it's
consideration of sacred in this, or including this?
It's included at this point. It's
As taboo or sacred.
yes. That's a good clarifying point. So basically, here's what we do in science. Is it problematic? Is the general kind of 30,000 feet view, whether it's sacred or taboo. And for the most part, these are the ones that were specifically responded to because they were taboo. But there's other data that I have that talks about, it could be there's two sides of the coin in some cases. It could be that we're uncomfortable with being in a lab where we're using corn or corn pollen because it's actually sacred to my tribe or seasonally important. And so it's a piece of the data that could be parsed out a little bit more and broken down into a more refined look at the issue. But certainly human dissection, human bodies, animal dissection, and a lot of other things that didn't make the list because they were lesser in percentage is on the list. But the 67%, I was like, whoa, that's interesting. 67% agreed that if science classes were more respectful of tribal taboos, such as by avoiding them or providing alternatives, they would be more likely to take science classes. And that's what we're trying to do, because you're not going to be a STEM major if you're not enrolling in STEM classes, or you're not going to be a STEM scientist if you don't complete the degree program. You're not entering into the scientific discourse if you don't have the credential and can meaningfully communicate in that world. So there's something going on here at this level we need to look at. Another big number that struck me was a substantially higher percentage of female respondents. 58% of females answered the questions affirmatively as to whether something was a taboo, which suggests that there might be a gender aspect to this. Maybe it's the female students in my context, but female members of tribes are the keepers of the tribal taboo knowledge, or maybe it's just a sensitivity. That warrants further investigation, because I'm just speculating at this point without having a more refined approach. The other piece, as I mentioned, was not just asking students, but asking faculties that advise or shepherd, mentor students through programs what they're observing. And so this was a really good one, really insightful one, that talked about, one obstacle, being the objections to dissecting animals, clan totems in particular, having significant importance in, or those that have significant importance in storytelling, like spiders, and, or organisms that are taboo because of the individual's relationship with that animal, maybe with the horses or other organisms that are higher on the list. So this part in the middle is, I think, important. Even though Western scientists might note that the physical aspect of the animal is dead and the physical aspect is all there is, for many Native people, the metaphysical aspect, the spiritual presence of the animal is real and still very much present. That's a quote from a faculty member at Haskell. So when I said there's philosophy, embedded in this, this faculty member was talking in terms of metaphysics, and talking and relating that to the objection to being a major in science. So the conclusion was, I think there are Native people who would be very put off by this kind of activity. It could cause them tremendous stress or anxiety, because in their traditions, this is not something that one would ordinarily engage in. Another one talked about this Navajo American student who was attending a non-tribal college, and was very enthusiastic about being a science major, but then ultimately got uncomfortable with certain activities and asked to be excused from them. And this particular college would not accommodate. And so I'm kind of come back to that word here at the end, because I think it's problematic, but it's also empowering legally. So this is a direct quote from the faculty member. I didn't even have to worry so much about using the word, because one of my sources did. So at this particular school, people were unwilling to be accommodating, which caused the student to pursue another major. They were led to believe that you can't be a scientist unless you do these kinds of things, which I think, the faculty member is saying, is one of these challenges that scientists need to be very aware of. That one story, maybe among dozens, hundreds, where students, because they were told they had to do this, basically said, well, if I have to do this, then I'm not going to be a scientist. A non-STEM faculty, to make my earlier point, talked about what they called reactive accommodation. I talk about, and I'm going to talk more about in upcoming research, proactive accommodation. But this is a non-science faculty member saying that they sometimes encounter the same kinds of reactions to showing human remains, like Kennewick Man, which I talked about in my other talk, and seasonal prohibitions on certain kinds of organisms, or retelling of creation stories. And so they kind of work with the kind of case by case, I guess, when they're presenting, and they said that as they arise, they flexibly adapt their lessons to satisfying students' concerns. And I want to get through more of this so that we have time for Q&A, but I can give you a story when I was first hired. Well, I'll give it to you now because it's relevant now, I suppose. So when I was first hired at Haskell to teach these classes that I'm surveying, they're very helpful, and here's slides that we use, and here's instructional ideas. And I was getting a lot of information from Native American faculty members. I'm not Native American. So one of the assignments for one of the classes that I taught was to have students write about their creation story. And so I assigned that assignment. And then some students completed it, and some students completed it with a kind of disclaimer or a little bit of history in the beginning about how they had to get permission from an elder to share that information, because I'm not Native American. Sometimes it's easier to, or it's appropriate to share information like that with a tribal, not necessarily a tribal member, but a member of the Native American heritage, and I'm not. But everybody who was sharing their resources with me was. So it's one of those teachable moments where I had to reactively accommodate. So the next time I taught that class, I said, if you're comfortable, if it's, if it's okay, you can share a creation story, or if you want to research a organism of significance or a plant. I broadened it out so I didn't have to create a space for students where they felt like to be successful in the class, they had to violate a code or something that they felt was privileged to their community. So sometimes you have to adapt. I love this one. This is another faculty quote because it gets at why should we care? I'll give you some other reasons, but this person's saying what I've been saying in other contexts, that we're missing out. The way I would say it is, one of the big reasons why we should want to recruit Native American students to major in science and to have Native American scholars in our discipline areas is because they bring a different way of knowing, a different perspective to the mix. And so we're not encountering those ideas. And we could maybe do some very easy things to make the environments more welcoming so that we do have those interactions. So this Haskell professor said, Western scientific institutions should be seeking out Native students because they do bring something very different to the practice of science that students who do not have that different cultural lens might not be able to see. So Native students may indeed see and experience things that could be informative and productive to research that other students may not. It's just a different lens, a different way of approaching a problem. And in environmental science, I can tell you, it's very important to have however many perspectives that we can get to solve some of the challenges we have today. And fortunately, I can say in environmental science and ecology examples, we have what's called co-management strategies, where it's becoming very common for tribal members to work with environmental practitioners to conserve an endangered species that might happen to be of significance to the tribe, like salmon. I've got some great examples of that, or other organisms, where you bring the tools of each individual's expertise into the room, which is why I'm a champion for interdisciplinary learning as well. Here you have what I'd call interdisciplinary epistemologies, interdisciplinary or at least multi-varying epistemologies that might actually get you faster on the way to solving a problem, more efficiently solving a problem, or more effectively solving the problem, because you're incorporating aspects that Western science may not always take into consideration. So in conclusion, what we know now, I think in hindsight, or what I know now after 17 years of contemplation from various vantage points, is that improving Native American participation in STEM requires that students' concerns be acknowledged and addressed, including allowing them to retain their cultural identities. Certainly some taboos cannot be practically or legally accommodated, because attempting to accommodate them may violate privacy or anti-discrimination laws. For example, there's taboos against menstruating women and separating from men. So you can't do that easily without causing some other kinds of concerns. Some taboos may not be accommodated without sacrificing necessary rigor and content of the discipline. So we don't want to forego the integrity of science or the process if we can help it. And we can help it, I think, because again, a lot of these common taboos can be reasonably addressed, and that's where I'm at today, is to say we need to have more conversations about what they are, and that's going to require some more research and also asking when we can. So providing alternatives to handling or dissecting specimen, might be a proactive accommodation, especially human cadavers and specimen that's coming out as being problematic. But I would say, and I have a few science faculty in the room or science professionals in the room, take inventory of your surroundings, or even if you're a non-STEM faculty member, what's hanging on your walls, what's on display that might be a microaggression, or it might be creating an unwelcoming learning space. And if we have specimens that are problematic, there's nothing magic about keeping them in a zone. You could maybe put them in a particular room or limit their presence so that you can welcome more into the conversation. allow culturally appropriate ceremonies to be performed. This was part, it wasn't on the slides, but one of the, in the open-ended question section of the survey, some students, more than one, there's at least 3, that said in their tribe, and there's different tribes, that part of the problem is that these organisms gave their life, in this case, for their study, for the furtherance of our understanding of science. Having an appropriate ceremony where you thank the organism for that might be enough to allow some to believe that you're adequately addressing concerns. So allowing ceremonies. Proactively engaging local tribes in conversation and respectfully asking them to document taboos and respectfully honoring when they don't want to share information. And then seek and share information with colleagues and through professional development or college scholar talks or asking questions of your Native friends and colleagues when you can. So I said I wanted to come back to reasonably accommodate because I'm working with that right now as an issue. I can say from my own experience and from what's documented in the literature, it's not a confidence thing. A lot of Native American students feel really strong about having an interest in science and wanting to participate. So it's not that Native Americans' exposure, interest, or confidence is lacking. That's there. But what we need to do is figure out how we can bridge some of the gaps that are there in these other arenas. So reasonably accommodate, that's often associated with ADA compliance, and that's why I say there's the empowerment part of it. Institutions are legally required to reasonably accommodate all students' sincerely held religious and moral beliefs. And what I'm looking at right now is, and I'm not finding, there has not been a successful legal challenge by Native students on the grounds that dissections or the kinds of activities we engage in Western science classrooms is offending a deeply held spiritual belief. But I believe that that is a viable possibility. So the other piece of this is accommodations are ultimately honored, or you're accommodated when you ask for an accommodation, and that's problematic because discussing taboos under these circumstances may be perceived itself as profoundly disrespectful, and so it's just not happening. So many Native Americans may still be inclined to altogether avoid situations rather than enter into those situations and request it. So next steps for me, and I think this is the last slide, I'm currently exploring the possible legal grounds that's for accommodating and trying to see if that is something that could inform our discussion. I'm developing surveys to interview Native American scientists who successfully navigated the Western science programs to obtain advanced degrees, because even if they secured a bachelor's degree at a tribal college level, chances are they probably went to a Western mainstream college to get a PhD or a master's. So how did they navigate these issues to successfully secure that credential and then enter into the field? Continue the data collection on taboos, and also invite collaborations and consultation with others who wish to extend the work. Especially needed is documentation of tribal taboos because it's not readily available. And then also I have a possible sabbatical project in the works because I'm going to be eligible within the next year or so for that. And I think it would take me to different places and look maybe at regional differences. So I'm playing with that at this time. So with that, I'll take questions. So Pharaoh told me she had to leave. She had to be over somewhere else at 1, so I'm going to pass the mic and take questions.
Yeah, Deb, I think approaching this, from the story, your experience with the Navajo woman, and sparking the idea of taboo being this obstacle. Really gave you an entry point into some pretty complex cultural issues there. One thing that occurred to me, and I think your informant seems to have suggested this direction, when they said that performing ceremonies of respect for the animals
Right.
would remove some of the obstacles to dissection. And before you had that, I was already thinking, okay, when you hunt and take an animal's life, before, during, and after, you're offering that respect, and you're doing so, in a sacred connection with the spirit of the animal. The obstacle is not in this case seems to be is not necessarily a taboo against taking the animal apart, right? So from taking the animal apart to use its parts for the various uses. The anatomy of that animal. The heart and the liver and the insides of the animal because you're respectfully utilizing those.
Yep.
But when Western scientists kind of approach, as you said, the thing as dead,
Right.
And an object. And sort of separate from, the continuum of life. That seems to be the real
Disconnect.
barrier, the real division there.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if that's a fruitful avenue to continue that
I think it
exploration.
is, and I think maybe in talking to, I'll let you have that because I'm live, so if others want to take the mic. I really think it is because I think that's when I envision in the doctoral research program is looking at Native Americans as students, as stakeholders, and as scientists. So the piece I think where I might get at some of that is asking Native American scientists after they've successfully navigated whether it's problematic or not, what their experiences are. Now they're in the field. What advice would they give to students who are Native and thinking about science? What advice would they give to non-Native scientists about how to better teach? And I think part of the series of questions that needs to be asked is exactly that. Ceremony is not a common feature of a lab protocol. There's nothing to say that you can't allow some space for that and still conduct your experiment or still do your dissection or whatever the activity of the day is. If that is what's needed, and if that's what's needed to be respectful, you're not taking away from the content, you're not taking away from the rigor, it's just doing things in a different way. But not knowing what those issues are and those options or those ways that might be more inviting is, I think, where we're at. So I think I'm at a place where I just need to ask. I need to ask the right questions and ask the right people who are either in the discipline or have navigated the Western science classroom experience, and what could they tell us now about what we could do better. And I believe that that's going to be a big part of it, is understanding the Native American metaphysical piece to all of this that, again, isn't something that we have in a typical science curriculum about Western metaphysics. That's a separate disciplinary and a separate class, but when you study and try to bring them together, it starts to make perfect sense. So thanks for that comment and question. I agree with you. Anyone else? Any questions? Nope.
This is kind of an odd question, but it's recently been brought to my attention, and then I saw it on your slide too, that owls are one of the taboo, and that's kind of our little mascot
Symbol
of our
wisdom.
honors office. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips on how to make a space more welcoming besides, like, if I take the owl stuff out of my office, do you have any suggestions on things that would be more welcoming instead of just taking things out? Is there anything I can add in?
This is where it's a challenge, because where I thought that question was going to go. I mean, 566 federally recognized tribe and several more. It's like, how can you meet everyone's needs? It's very, very complex, because the minute you take the owl down and you put something else up, you might have or maybe put nothing up at all. You're going to have people have opinions both ways, and so I think ask, or with certain tribes, Navajo again is one of them. It's an omen of bad. It's an omen of death, And there are ceremonies that, I had a student tell me one semester that he was driving to town with a group of friends, and an owl flew across the road, and they turned around and they went back home. So it can be that. And then I've had others, indicate that it's not particularly significant in their tribe. But it kind of depends, I think, on if you want to be perfectly safe, as anything is identified, particularly in a public-facing office that serves a broad audience. I have owl jewelry, and I don't wear it anymore at Haskell. To me, it's a symbol of wisdom. It's a symbol. You see it in commercials. You can't reconcile everything, but the things that you can do, you have to have that conversation with your staff and ask yourself, is it important to have that as your icon or not? And if it's something that you think has a potential impact, keep in mind that Navajos are the largest populated tribe. It was the largest survey respondents in my experience. So it may be something that you give some consideration to as far as removing. In the classroom for specimen, it's a matter of just maybe moving them into a different room, or again, depending on the activity or the organism, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, really, on what you can and ought to do that's still going to respect the curriculum, but be an inclusive environment. It's a good question.
So those were third graders that were running through the hall here for the museum program.
Right.
I'm thinking about the art collection because our tours and our experiences are very interactive, and it doesn't work unless everybody's participating and they're asking questions and answering questions. But in that regards, we know sometimes people don't raise their hand and they don't participate, and then I wonder, there's so many reasons why that might be the case, but it could, in some cases, very well be that somebody is not comfortable with the subject matter for a reason that we had no idea.
Right.
So we had no idea if we have an animals and art tour for kids, for example, and I'm thinking about things in a different way. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Tara, because it is, I was thinking very much in terms of the Natural History Museum, where you have the specimen either alive or dead on display, and thinking, we're working with art. It's a symbol. It's a representation. It's not the real thing. But I can see now that there is kind of that gray area where it still could be potentially something they don't want to talk about. And I'm just glad for that perspective. So thank you. I don't have a question.
No, thank you for your comment. It's helpful. Rick? Looks like.
So is there anything so you mentioned taboos, but is there anything about science itself and how it's conducted in terms of, like less dissecting, more holistic or something like that would be of more interest to natives? I'm not sure, but are you looking into that at all?
Well, I can speak to it based on my own experience. As a bridge program coordinator, and then science is very broad, and we have carve-outs, disciplinary expertise. So the grant I was the program coordinator for was a National Institute of Health grant, and it was a biomedical research grant. I'm an ecologist, and I had a lot of students who were, if they're interested in scientists, they were kind of native students who came and talked to me. They seemed to be gravitating towards the ecology professors. So we happened to have a list of potential mentors, because that was part of the grant experiences, remove all of those barriers and teach how science is taught, but also match them up with professors at KU that were willing to work and receptive to, and also screened that we thought would be good mentors for Native American students. And it seemed like biomedical, broadly defined, was a better way of approaching that than narrowly defined, because while we did have some students that ultimately wanted to be pre-med, or now what we would call biotechnology, back then it was like just generally bioscience. We had a lot of students who were interested in speech, language, and hearing, or they were interested in ecology because they had particular challenges in their tribal communities that they wanted to come and learn how to correct and then go back and be a part of the solution. So I think science, when it has meaning, like the meaningful connections, is what I found students at Haskell, at least in that population, really interested in pursuing. So I think we need to provide more opportunities for that. And then if we have other areas of science, show the applicability, more so than maybe it's apparent. It may be apparent to us, but it may not be apparent to those who aren't thinking about it in the ways that we think about what the utility is or what the meaningful connections are, to use the language of the literature, to their lives. So, thank you.
I just wanted to say, do you think it's possible, I know it's still relatively new, that it can go to a large scale? Because I know people are very reluctant to change. While you can change posters, and that's kind of easier, but it's harder to actually change something like dissections and procedures that have been around for lots of years. So do you think it'd be possible to go large scale, or would it be something that's more selective, and there's some places that are going to be able to accommodate, not nationwide?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. And as I said, there's some things that we identify as being problematic that we really aren't going to be able to change in a meaningful way. But something like dissection, especially today, I mean, it's not perfect, but we have instructional tools, simulations, we have, there's always, visuals that we can use as a substitute, particularly when you think about it, the levels that we're teaching here, 100 and 200 level classes, it's a different kind of learning objective than medical school. In fact, there's a great example in my paper, but also it's a story that's out there, and she's Navajo as well, about a Navajo doctor, and her last name is Alvord, who published a book on this very topic, about essentially one of the hardest things for her as a pre-med student. I mean, she wanted to be a doctor, and she wanted to give back to her community, but she had to sort of reconcile what her belief system was in furtherance of her pursuit of her degree. So dissections, we might have, depending on, if you're medical school, you're going to have to deal with bodies, you're going to have to deal with dissection, you're going to have to deal with human specimen. But if you're an undergraduate institution and it's a non-science major, or it's a non-professional degree seeking program, maybe there's some room for alternative accommodations in the learning experience. But I can say another example from my own experience, and this was with a non-native student. I taught a class at KU as a graduate student called organismic biology. We have it here. And so there was a phase where we had fetal pig dissections, but the organismic biology had plants and animals, and ultimately I had one student who, the more complex the animal, the plants she didn't have much issues with, the organisms, when it got more complex, more complex than a starfish, she didn't want to dissect. She didn't want to even really touch. And so we had resources even back then that she could go to this biological teaching resource center, and we had computer simulations that she could learn the anatomy of the fetal pig, or whatever, the crayfish, or whatever the case may be. But she was expected to, she was still tested on the organism, just like everyone else was. So while we didn't want to make her, dissect, and she didn't have to dissect, we had all other alternative ways for her to learn generally the subject matter. She still had to be held to the same standard as the other students, and that meant, identifying what the pin was stuck in, or what the collection specimen was. So you can work with some of these instructional issues to a point, but I'm always left with the question, is having taught a number of dissection classes, there's so much individual variation. You go from fetal pig to fetal pig, and there's morphological variations, there's texture variations, there's color variations. You're not getting that in a static diagram. You're not getting that in a simulation, because the simulations are, as good as they may be, they're not that good. Where if you're going to be a major in physiology or anatomy, or a medical professional, you really probably need to have the interaction with the specimen. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate your questions and comments.